I've often contemplated the fact that Christianity has had such an extraordinary and powerful influence in the history of our planet. And in fact, Jesus had a public ministry, at least in training the disciples who then disseminated his message, excuse me, for just 3 years. The so-called lost years of Jesus, it's become increasingly accepted that Jesus was in India and in Tibet during those years, and even, in fact, did much spiritual work there. But there's no direct remnant of his time there, except the disciple Thomas, who went over later and then established Christianity there. The teachings of Jesus, I believe it was Thomas, but in any case, there's a whole enclave there. People are nodding to me, so I've said it correctly. Okay. So there were a handful of disciples. There were 12 apostles. Judas betrayed him and then committed suicide, so there were 11 left. There were undoubtedly a number of others whose names we no longer recall, Mary Magdalene, and there's no women named, and yet he had many women disciples. And then he was crucified, and he apparently went away. He was resurrected to those who saw him, which were a number of people, but still only a tiny handful. He didn't write any books. There was no video. It was just, that was it. But somehow or another, he communicated to those who were with him something that was so powerful. And even more than that, he left an impression somewhere in the infinite, in ways that I couldn't begin to understand. He left an impression somewhere of his consciousness that people have been able to access up until the present moment exactly. That he remanifests himself in physical form, in visionary form, as conveniently and easily now, for those who are able to receive it, as he walked around. It was no more unusual to see him walking around than it is for a deeply devoted disciple to commune with him, even to see him in one form or another. And even more interestingly, the real power, the real creation, you might say, of that movement that came off of Jesus' teachings was mostly done by Paul. Taking apart Thomas and everything that he did in India, which was almost like a separate effort that happened there. And the other disciples traveled around. But what really endured and really planted the teaching of Christianity was all the missionary work that Paul did. Paul was actually the one who took it outside of Judaism. The whole time that Jesus lived and all his disciples, it was almost entirely a sect of Judaism, which makes the conflict between Christianity and Judaism supremely ironic, to say the least. But after Jesus died, the disciples, who were all Jews, did not find a receptivity in the established Jewish tradition. And Paul was just too full of zeal to take no for an answer. So he had what at the time was a very revolutionary idea, that maybe this would go beyond Judaism. Maybe this was really the good news for everyone. So he went to what, from the Jewish perspective, is called the Gentiles, and created a whole new reality, which became Christianity. Now, Paul himself never met Jesus. He was not, although he was a contemporary, he was not drawn to Jesus when Jesus was there in the physical body. Only afterwards, and in fact, Paul was a zealous persecutor of the followers of Jesus, and he was on his way to persecute the followers of Jesus when he was on the road to Damascus. That's how the story is told, and he was struck blind. And in his blindness to this world, he perceived another world in which Jesus appeared to him. And Jesus said, "Why are you doing this to my followers?" And Paul did not have a good answer at that point. And for a number of days, Paul was blind while he contemplated what had happened to him. And when he came out of that blindness, he had been Saul before he was struck blind. He became Paul after his vision of Jesus. And then he became the one who really put it on the map, so to speak. Now, there's many interesting aspects to this, and one of the reasons I'm thinking about this a lot is because Swami Kriyananda has just passed from this world, as most of you know, just about 2 months ago now. And so now I'm living in a reality I've never had to live in before, which is that the source, the personified source of my understanding of the spiritual path no longer has a physical form. And so I'm getting to live with how much is external, how much is internal. Where is the consciousness of a great soul? Where is the consciousness of Master? And a lot of this has to do with this idea of time and this idea of the eternal nature of reality that only seems to shift around. Because there was Paul having a vision of Jesus, and it was it appears to be that Jesus manifested himself to him. You can see in vision, or sometimes the great souls manifest to us. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda describes how after his guru Sri Yukteswar passed from this earth, he was very distraught. At least that's how he presents it to us. It's hard to read between the lines of a great master's saga of his own incarnation. But from the perspective that Yogananda was living in a human body and had been accustomed to being able to go visit his guru, now his guru was no longer there in the physical body. But Sri Yukteswar resurrected for Yogananda. He didn't merely come in a vision, he resurrected. And Yogananda talks about embracing him and feeling the flesh and bones. He talks about touching his feet and feeling the toes inside his shoes. He gives us as many tangible expressions of the fact that Sri Yukteswar simply remanifested a body. And when he remanifested the body, you see, what he was showing is that I appeared to die, but did I really die? I appear to be gone, but here I am again. And the only reason that is confusing to us is because we have a linear concept of time. If you were alive and then you died, how can you again be alive? I think last week I shared with you, but I will repeat it again. I had a little inner dialogue with Swami Kriyananda when I was in seclusion a couple of weeks ago, saying to him, looking at his picture, because I have never been a grown-up without him being around somewhere on the planet, I said, "What will I do, sir, now that you're gone?" And I felt him strongly answering me, "What makes you think I'm gone?" And because I often have had cheeky conversations with him, I answered in a perfectly natural way. "I went to Italy, sir, and your corpse was in the casket. I was there for a week. It was there the whole time." And again, I felt his response, "What does that have to do with anything?" It's just like all of a sudden, well, what does that have to do? How can I even be having what I really felt to be was a real conversation with him? What makes you think I'm gone? Well, Swamiji, I don't know. What does make me think you're gone? You were 87, your body wasn't working very well, it stopped breathing. Those are the signs we usually take. But it's all about time, you see. The body grew old, the body passed away, and now we can't simultaneously be in more than one reality at the same time, because one precludes the other when you're going in a straight line. Swamiji's picture of time, which he presented in his book called The Time Tunnel, which is like a juvenile fiction, adolescent fiction, meaning it's for older children, but it's really an adult book. But when he has to explain these concepts down to a mind that may be a little less sophisticated, I was able to understand it. I asked him if he would write the Gita for children, the Bible for children, then maybe all of us could learn some of these teachings. But his concept, he showed time as a wheel, thinking of a big bicycle wheel. And we live on the rim of that wheel. So when we're standing on the rim of the wheel, where you're standing, you can see a little behind you and a little ahead of you. But you just, even though you're going in a circle in this image, still, present is present, future is future, past is past. And eternity See, we tend to think of it as, here we are in time and eternity is there and we'll sort of march somehow and eventually we'll get to eternity. That's the picture. But when we think of it as a circle, with eternity being in the middle, we're always as close to eternity as any point. We're never farther away from it. We're always just the same in relationship to it. It's very different when we go like that than when we go in a line. And then even more powerfully, if we think in terms of changing our orbit, so to speak, to a concentric circle that's closer to the center. You see? That instead of orbiting on the farthest edges of the definition of ourselves, I am a material body, I was born at a certain time, I am of a certain age, I'm gradually getting older and running out of steam, and pretty soon I'll just fall over like that. And maybe I'll move into the astral world, and maybe I'll come back. But we see it all in this very linear way. But even if we did that same cycle in a circle, an orbit that was closer in, you see, we're closer now to an understanding of eternity. And from that more inner perspective, another way to think of it is spokes in the wheel. Do we live at the far edge of that spoke, or do we live a little closer in? And when you're closer in on the wheel, suddenly your field of vision is wider if you look out to the rim, and your vibration is closer to the center if you look in. Swami Kriyananda described, he was born with a very elevated state of consciousness, and when he was a child, he writes this in The Path, he said from his earliest childhood, I think even his babyhood, when he would fall asleep at night, a great light would appear at the spiritual eye, which was referred to in our reading today. A great light would appear in front of him. He would concentrate on that light. It would gradually expand until he merged into it, at which point he would go to sleep, as he put it. He said it was many, many years before he found out that this isn't the way everyone fell asleep. He just thought this is what you do. You're born in a physical body, you see the light at night, and you just go into the light. You know, children have no context for their own consciousness. Interestingly, I was reading a biography about Vivekananda, the great disciple of Ramakrishna, and he described exactly the same thing. It was almost word for word what Swami Kriyananda described about his childhood experience of seeing the light, and that's how he fell asleep at night. It was fascinating to see. Now, the interesting point here is that Swami Kriyananda says later, much later, he fell away from that habit when he began to realize how odd it was, and he tried to conform more to the world. He also, just to explain it, Swami had a period of, when he was 9, when he became very ill and he had a long period of delirium. And he said it made him wary of any unusual state of consciousness. This was just the sadhana he played out. So he lost connection with that until he came back to master, learned Kriya, and then learned to meditate, looking at the spiritual eye. Swami saw the same light, went into the same light. He said, and as soon as he stepped into the light, this is the part, no time had passed. It was exactly the same moment as it had been when he was a child and had gone into that same light. You see, he'd gone off the rim of the wheel and had walked into the center of the wheel. He walked into it in his infancy. He walked into it as adulthood, and it was the same. He had shifted his place on the wheel, but that was just the illusion. This was the reality from which everything emanated. Now, you see, from that point, Jesus dying, Jesus resurrecting, it being 2,000 years later, us being standing there when he was crucified on the cross, all of that is happening in the past, present, and future on the rim. But none of it is really different. Everything is always happening in eternity simultaneously. The entire wheel emanates from that point of eternity. Do you understand? And all of this is not just abstractions. This is the power of our belief that we can be disciples of a master that we've never met, that the whole world can be transformed by the commitment of those who believe so strongly in the power of what Jesus had to give that they were able to persuade all these people who'd never ever met them. And there's this force of magnetism that we have when we begin to move closer and closer into that eternal now. This was an abstraction of time that I never could understand and never felt was relevant to me, because I couldn't figure out what I would do with it. I like things that I can use. I don't like to have a lot of stuff in my house that I can't use. I don't like to have a lot of stuff in my mind that isn't helpful to me. There's so much stuff in my mind already. I really like to keep out of it what is not helpful. In this respect, Sherlock Holmes said to Watson, there was some question about the orbits of the planets in relation to the sun, and Sherlock Holmes indicated his complete ignorance of that fact. Watson, who rarely had it up on Sherlock, was very pleased to explain this fact of astronomy because Sherlock was ignorant of it. And after the detective, Sherlock Holmes, took in the information, he said to Watson, "Now that I've understood what you said, I will do my best to forget it." He said, "The mind is like an attic. If you fill it too much with things you don't need, when you go up there to look for what you really have to have, you won't be able to find it." So spiritually speaking, there's a lot of things that are fascinating, but I've tried to hold on to myself those things that are practical. So it's a source of enormous personal gratification when something very abstract suddenly becomes really, really useful. Oh my gosh, it's always there. And all we have to do is just move off the rim and move back in a little to the center, and that power is there for us. Last night, for the spiritual cinema, they showed this movie. It's called Come to the Stable. It's a little-known film. It stars Loretta Young when she was young and exceedingly beautiful. And it's the story of a group of French nuns who feel inspired by God to come to America to found this children's hospital. And it is the story of how they manifest what is really an impossibility. And it's a very sweet story and very sweetly done, and done in a way that is actually true to the real principles of spiritual life. And one of the things that happens in this movie, which, you know, movies can make this happen for you. This nun and her sisters, they just have this belief that is more than belief, that is actual faith. Faith means they have experienced the power of what they're saying. It's not just that somebody told them, it's that they know. This woman plays the part. She knows that God is in charge, and if she does what God says, then everything is going to work out. Whether it works out or doesn't, you know, when things look like they're not going to work out, she's disappointed, or she has to master her, she has to readjust her expectations. But she nonetheless has this complete commitment to the fact that I'm acting according to God's call, and if I act according to God's call, everything will come out exactly as it's supposed to. And the plot of the movie is how others simply cannot resist the power of that commitment. She has this deep commitment to this force of the divine, and others, just like leaves in the river, just get swept into it. But swept into it, and this is where the movie is true, in this beautiful, expansive way for them. And of course, if we go back and think about St. Paul going out and just informing these people who had never considered the point, and the Gentiles at that time were very far away from Sanatan Dharma, the power of the Jews, and the reason that Jesus came to the Jews is that the Jews were still a very elevated and had a very refined understanding of divine truth. They had a corrupt priesthood, and that was a problem. But the essence of Judaism was still intact, and it's a true religion. Paul went out to a place where they really didn't know anything. They were worshiping false gods, meaning there was no sense of overarching reality. They just thought this little idol could do things for them, and so on like that. So he introduced this whole new idea: eternal life, salvation, self-realization, the good news, bliss beyond imagination of expectancy. And Master says that Jesus taught Kriya, and his disciples taught Kriya, or something very much like it, which is he gave those people the power not only to listen to his words, but to do something within themselves that changed their belief to experience. And once your belief changes to experience, and you know that we don't have to live on this little rim of being trapped in past, present, future, time, death, all those annoying factors that seem to be what life is about, limitation, poverty, lack of control over our lives, just being a helpless victim of destiny. Not at all. We can move right up those spokes and stand in the eternal now, in which past, present, and future, they're just all ours. And that which has been lost from sight when we're living in a linear manner is absolutely accessible to us. Swami Kriyananda, when he would talk about Master, I remember on several occasions of Master's Mahasamadhi, he wanted us, almost the word I want to use is he would plead with us. You must understand, he is not gone. And of course, that was an idea to me that I only understand on a much deeper level now that Swami has left this world, seemingly, although I don't know what makes me think he's gone. But nonetheless, there has been a shift. There's been a shift in our perception. But Swamiji would say so strongly, he said, he is as present now as he has ever been. And this is what our scripture is also emphasizing. We don't suddenly become one with God. We just notice. We just notice all of a sudden what was always there. We've been trapped on the rim and we feel ourselves distant from the center. But we don't realize that we are one with the whole of it. All we have to do is turn and receive it. All we have to do is move into that. And belief becomes faith when the belief becomes strong enough that we are willing to devote our time, energy, our commitment to proving to ourselves that this is true. I mean, if you don't believe it at all, you don't even try. You go to someone and say, joy is within you. Yeah, ha, ha. Someone said, I hope God likes burritos because I've heard God is within me and he sure gets a lot of them. It's just ridiculous ways people kind of interpret these things. But when we start with the fact that joy is within you, this is the motto that Swami gave us, you see, everything is different. Oh, I feel badly because. I feel separated from someone I love because. I feel disappointed because. I feel that I don't have enough resources because. But if joy is within you, if the divine is within us, if eternity is now, if we have as much of God now as we will ever have him, what makes us think that that reality is gone? It's a marvelous trick you can play on your mind. The definition, the determination of my life with this intense intellectual interest I've always had is not intellectual. It's because I know that if I can get my mind turned in just the right way, it will trap my heart. And it'll make me say, oh, I feel sad because Swami is gone. And then my mind says, oh, what makes you think he's gone? I'm having a really hard time coming up with an answer to that. What makes us think we're separated from God? What makes us think that we have to wait for the divine experience we're going to have? Eventually, Lahiri Mahashaya said, eventually, why not now? And Yogananda said he loves the American spirit. He said, in India, after all these ages of these teachings, they know that it's very hard to find God. And so when you say we can realize God, people say, yeah, when my karma allows it in some future incarnation. Master said Americans, he didn't use this word, but the actual word is being so utterly ignorant of these things, not having the foggiest idea, and having this amazing can-do spirit, he would come and say, let's realize God. And they would say, sure, why not? And that's why self-realization was able to be planted in America. Because we're a people who make things happen. We're a practical people. We have our flaws, but we're a practical people who make things happen. And because we don't have any history particularly, Michelangelo didn't do his great art in our city, and great civilizations haven't arisen and fallen, and we don't have evidence of thousands of years of advancement. We just came to an empty land and knocked out the people who were already there and then just started cutting down the trees and doing what we could. It's always been with our own hands, let's go forward. But America was the only country, therefore, in which this entire new idea could be planted, because there was nothing to interrupt it. Even just the idea, in Italy, we had a very hard time calling our work a church, because the Italians looked at each other. There is one church. That's the Catholic Church. The mere idea that you would start a church to Europeans was just like, it was a non sequitur. They couldn't even fathom what that was. Where in America, we start churches all the time. Why not? We do everything. Why not? We realize, God, why not? What makes us think we can't? What makes us think we have to wait? Joy is within you. Take that as a belief, as deeply as you can absorb it, and devote yourself to turning that into faith. Why not? God bless you.